Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
We've already paid a visit to the Scottish philosopher David Hume, a go-to source for a lot of modern-day skeptics. But I don't think I'm quite finished with his philosophy yet. So here we go again on today's edition of Authentic.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
I think this week we're going to take another look at David Hume because for some people he seems to be the paragon of skepticism when it comes to Christians and the faith we place in the words of the Bible. And in particular, I think I want to revisit his famous essay about miracles because he seems to be of the opinion that believing in the miraculous somehow makes you a less intelligent person. Now, just before I kick the ball down the field, I should probably disclose my own point of view on miracles because I happen to believe that even without miracles, there are still a lot of reasons to consider the Christian faith. My faith in the existence of God and the divine inspiration of His Word does not depend on the existence of miracles. In fact, the Bible contains a number of clear warnings that sometimes just relying on the evidence of our senses is not enough. It can deceive us into believing something that, well, just ain't so. So, with that disclaimer, let's get started on our study. And for a little bit, it's going to feel like I'm nitpicking because I'm going to carefully parse some of the language that Hume uses in the first 2 pages of his essay. And given the time constraints we have, I'm probably going to have to leave the bulk of the essay untouched. And the reason I'm doing that is because Mr. Hume presents some assumptions at the top of this work that I think should be examined very carefully because, at least from where I sit, they're nowhere near as bulletproof as some people seem to think they are. And if we discover that his starting assumptions might not be true, well, let's just say the rest of the essay starts to fall apart like tissue paper in the rain. He begins by discussing the writings of Dr. John Tillotson, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury near the end of the 17th century. Back in 1684, Dr. Tillotson wrote something he called Discourse Against Transubstantiation. Now, just in case you're not familiar with transubstantiation, it's the belief that the bread and the wine that churches use in the communion service are quite literally changed into the actual flesh and blood of Christ. And if the evidence of your senses is telling you that it's still just bread and wine because it looks like bread and wine, and it feels like bread and wine, and it tastes like bread and wine, well, proponents of transubstantiation would tell you, you're just wrong. Dr. Tillotson, who did not believe in this doctrine, argued that the reason it appears to be bread and wine is because it actually is. So, David Hume picks up on that discussion because he was an empiricist. And he argues that the evidence of your senses is all you have to go by in this world. He said that the testimony of other people is a weaker reason to believe than the things you personally see, hear, smell, touch, or taste for yourself. So, really, if you think about it, Hume places his own personal experience over the personal experiences of other people. And to a point, I actually think he's right. In most cases, personal experience certainly leaves a stronger impression than a story you hear from somebody else. But at the same time, I do have to ask myself what life would look like if we took Hume's assumptions out of the world of religion and applied them to the rest of our lives. I mean, what would it be like if we always insisted that we had to experience something in order to believe it? And wouldn't you know it, there's a story in the Bible that actually raises that very question. And it actually pertains to the resurrection of Christ, the central miracle of Christianity, which, of course, David Hume rejected. And in this story, it's almost as if the Bible is anticipating Mr. Hume's insistence on strict empirical methods. It's usually called the story of Doubting Thomas, and it's found over in John chapter 20, shortly after the resurrection of Christ. And it says this, "And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now, I know a lot of people are going to find that story unsatisfying because, as a general rule, smart people do not take other people's words at face value, particularly if they're trying to build a working model for life and trying to decide how best they should live. And of course, over the last 2,000 years, especially during the medieval period, there have been far too many cases where the church just told people to accept what they were being taught because we said so. It's a formula that occasionally works with toddlers, but not so much with the rest of us. So, of course, when history suddenly carried us into the Protestant Reformation and then the Enlightenment, there were a lot of people who rightfully argued against the idea that we should just accept ideas because somebody happens to be wearing a bishop's mitre. Sometimes, people discovered, the bishop was making stuff up in order to maintain power. Maybe the most famous example we have is the donation of Constantine, a forgery drafted in order to make it appear as if the Roman emperor had personally given the church permanent temporal power over the territory of Western Europe. It was a document that was made up for the sake of clinging to power. And it's hardly the only example. The medieval period tragically provides us with all kinds of clerical fictions, like the story the church was circulating about a guy who was plowing his field on a Sunday and had his hand divinely fused to the plow as a punishment from God. It was obviously fiction designed to keep the peasants in line. So, I would argue that yes, Hume's brand of skepticism is really very useful when it comes to assessing the world of religion because, well, religion has this tendency to attract a boatload of charlatans. But now, let's just push that to one side for a moment and think about doubting Thomas. Because this wasn't a story written 1,000 years after it happened. It was preserved by the people who were actually there, the people who knew Thomas, and they had firsthand knowledge of the life and ministry of Christ. And what the Bible gives us is a story about a strict empiricist who demanded to see the evidence for himself. And by 21st century standards, that's a completely noble thing to do. It makes sense. And it's probably what I would have done. But what Jesus says to Thomas is something we really ought to consider. You're not always going to have personal sensory input to help you affirm things. Now, let's read a little bit from Hume's essay on miracles, and I'm going to pick on one single word here. He says, "It is acknowledged on all hands," says that learned prelate, he's talking about Dr. Tillotson, "that the authority either of the Scripture or of tradition is found merely in the testimony of the apostles, who were eyewitnesses to those miracles of our Savior by which he proved his divine mission." So let's explore that one word, merely, because it was deliberately put there to underline a point. Hume believed that personal experience is almost always stronger than evidence from someone else's testimony. And of course, that seems logical because most of us assume that if you can see and touch something, it's far more likely to be real. But then ask yourself this: what would it take for you to personally affirm that any historical event ever happened? You know what it would take? It would take the invention of time travel. And the truth is that a lot of historians would be delighted to have the kind of detailed account we have for Jesus when it comes to almost any other historical figure. We have lots of material about Jesus, but I get the feeling that skeptics reject it sometimes because it was written by people who liked him. And of course, eyewitness testimony can be faulty, but it's far from useless. And I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
David Hume's insistence that we need to assess everything for ourselves using the evidence of our senses has a few obvious problems, not the least of which is the unreliability of sensory input and the unreliability of our memory. Let me use an example I've used in the past, which comes from the life of Ayn Rand, who called herself an objectivist and insisted that her perception of the world was always 100% accurate. It happened when she was recovering from surgery and became utterly convinced she saw a tree outside her hospital window, even though her room was far too high for any tree to be visible. What she was seeing was the reflection of her IV pole, and because of the pain meds and the after effects of general anesthesia, she thought she was seeing a tree. And she was such a devoted empiricist and frankly such a prideful person that she flew off the handle when a friend of hers tried to suggest that her perception might be wrong. And obviously, it was. I mean, the truth is that our senses are notoriously imperfect, and so is our memory. And to suggest, like David Hume, that our sensory perception is always stronger than evidence from eyewitness testimonies, well, it doesn't always stack up that way. I mean, just consider what life would be like if you demanded firsthand evidence for absolutely everything you're going to believe. I was born in a tiny town up in northern British Columbia. Soaking wet, we were barely 5,000 people. And the first real city close to us, well, it wasn't close at all. In fact, I never saw a big city until I was about 10 years old. And that was Edmonton, which wasn't really a big city by global standards, at least not back in those days. I understand today it's actually over 1 million people. So, living in this tiny village, my personal experience of the world was rather limited. We had a couple of radio stations, and 1.5 TV stations, and of course, no internet. My knowledge of the broader world came from the town library. And fortunately, I've always loved reading. And the other day, as I was cleaning out my basement, I found this school report I wrote when I was just 9 years old, back in the 4th grade. It was a report about Saudi Arabia, and it was written on construction paper and held together with a piece of yarn that I threaded through some holes I punched up on the left-hand side. When I look at that report now, I'm finding it to be remarkably accurate. A little thin on details, but factual. And it was factual even though I had never experienced the outside world. I wrote it with nothing but the written records of other people who had actually seen Saudi Arabia for themselves. So you've got to wonder what would have happened if I'd told my teacher, look, there's no way I can write a good report unless I hop on a plane and go visit the Middle East. That's just not the way real life works for most of us most of the time. I mean, of course, you'd have to assume that my report would have been better. I mean, it would have included some Polaroids, but of course it was never going to happen, and all I had was eyewitness testimony. Now, of course, I know that the age of the internet has led to some real problems because it seems much easier to manipulate information, and we could all afford to be a little more skeptical. What David Hume was talking about, though, was improbable stuff like miracles, so it doesn't quite equate. Nothing in my school report was even a little bit improbable. I said the climate is hot, the desert is dry, the people dress differently than we do, and I said Islam was more popular than Christianity. All of that was strictly factual, and none of it was unreasonable or improbable, so Hume would have been fine with that report. What he was going after was miracles, things that by his own definition were a violation of natural law. And for that, he demanded better evidence. And honestly, I can sympathize with that. But let's be honest, nobody can build a time machine to go and witness the resurrection of Christ. But that doesn't mean we can't accept the testimony of people who were there. It might be weaker evidence than seeing it yourself, but it's still evidence. And it's not like we only have a tiny fragment of some ancient document to help us study the life of Christ. We have multiple detailed accounts, which I must say is all that anybody has for any historical figure, at least before the advent of TV or radio. In fact, we often have far less written evidence for other well-known historical characters. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that David Hume was wrong, and on many fronts I tend to agree with him. And I also tend to demand good evidence for what I'm going to believe. But I am saying that Mr. Hume's rejection of the Gospels is not as great an argument as he would have us believe. I mean, if we're going to reject anything that we haven't experienced for ourselves, it's going to lead to a really hard life, because you and I accept all kinds of things through hearsay. Most of us have never personally conducted the experiments that led to the scientific revolution, but we still believe in things like nuclear energy. And if we had to reproduce everything for ourselves before we could believe it, that would be an absurd existence. And of course, David Hume wasn't really talking about probable things. He was talking about improbable, like the resurrection of a dead person. Then again, a lot of things that we take for granted today seemed really improbable when somebody discovered them, like the discovery that a feather in a bowling ball will fall at exactly the same rate of speed if you put them in a vacuum. Now, there's another key problem with David Hume's assumptions, which is the idea that all Christians have is the eyewitness accounts of very dead and very ancient people. I mean, it certainly looks that way, but what we have in the pages of the Bible is the testimony of people who said they had a personal experience with a personal God. The Bible is the record of a creator who not only made the world we live in, but continued to interact with us. David Hume might suggest that this is weak because it's third-party eyewitness testimony. But what he seems to neglect is the way that the Bible indicates that these authors were inviting us to experience the same God for ourselves today. The Bible is not the sum total of our evidence. It's more like a travel guide where the author expects that you're going to follow the same road and meet the same God. So, yes, this is a record of somebody else's experience, but it's also an invitation to join them, to encounter the same God for yourself, which is what Paul suggests in his letter to the Romans. I mean, just listen to what he says in Romans chapter 15. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So, in other words, the reason we have the Bible is because the people who encountered God in the past are trying to show us how to recognize Him in the present so we can share in their hope. And then Paul says this over in his second letter to Timothy. He says, "But you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus." So instead of thinking of the Bible in terms of the kind of eyewitness testimony delivered in a Western jury trial, it might be better to think of this book as a detailed invitation or an old-fashioned letter of introduction, the kind that emissaries used to carry from their king in order to prove to another king that they were trustworthy. But in this case, it's the king himself getting the introduction. This book was written by people who hoped you would also get a chance to have a personal experience with that same God. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
David Hume rejected the possibility of miracles on the basis of personal experience and probability. The only way he would ever accept that a miracle might be possible, he said, was if the falsification of the story proved to be more absurd than the miracle story itself. And by doing that, I think he was trying to lock himself away in a little corner of the philosophical universe where he could avoid ever having to deal with the idea of a personal God ever again. But as I was suggesting right before the break, the Bible is not simply eyewitness testimony, the way that somebody at, say, Waterloo would have recorded their personal recollections of Napoleon. Those kinds of records are simply history, and there's no expectation that you're ever going to meet Napoleon for yourself. But the authors of the Bible were people who knew that their readers, or maybe more accurately, their listeners, they were going to be able to meet that same Creator God. So they left us a guidebook that points us in the right direction. It enables us to actually discern the face of God. But then when we do encounter God, there's another problem that often emerges. Most of us have a mental image of what God is supposed to be like, whether we got that from books or TV shows or from a Sunday school class. But then when we're suddenly faced with the reality of God, and He doesn't match our preconceived expectations, well, a lot of people will then tend to reject the experience. In fact, when they hear something about God that doesn't quite resonate with what they've previously understood, sometimes you'll hear them say, "That's not what my God is like." But if God is real and He's a personal God, an honest-to-goodness, real sentient being with emotions and character traits, well, why in the world would we expect Him to conform to the models we create in our minds? I mean, think about all your intimate relationships. If your spouse or one of your friends always did and said exactly what you expected, well, you'd start to suspect that you were dealing with a bot and not a human being. So let's explore one of the stickier problems we have with the Bible, one that a lot of skeptics love to bring up when they discuss the possibility of an omnipotent, all-powerful God. It's the rather stark record of wartime violence that you find in the Old Testament. Now, I'll be the first to admit, at a brief glance, it looks like God is advocating for cold-blooded genocide. And it's not an easy subject. And I promise you, you're not going to figure this out with a 5-minute study. In fact, I've been studying it for years, and I think I have found some answers, but I'd be lying if I said I understood it all. What tends to happen is that people will read a brief and violent account and they experience a bit of cognitive dissonance because in their minds, God should always be gentle and He should never encourage any kind of violence for any reason under any circumstance. But then you need to ask yourself, why do I think that? I mean, yes, it's true, God hates pain and suffering, and so do I. And I would never want to cause bodily harm. But then again, what would I do in a home invasion where somebody clearly intends to do my family serious harm? At that point, what exactly are my options? Should I ask them, don't do it, very politely, and then stand by while they slaughter my family? Or do I intervene and do what it takes to stop them? Now, that's not a perfect example because obviously I'm not God and I'm certainly not omnipotent or all-knowing. But if I'm honest about it, I can think of a dozen reasons why I might have to step out of character to mitigate evil. So then I have to ask myself how God could, 1, preserve our free will, which grants us the ability to love, but then 2, at the same time, somehow keep evil in check. Many people assume that when God says, go into that village and don't you leave any survivors, that He was terminating perfectly innocent people. But maybe, in a world where religious wingnuts fly airplanes into office towers and nobody's ever going to talk them out of doing it, well, maybe there are cases where eliminating the threat might be the only option. Sometimes terminating the terrorist is the only option you've got. Now, believe me, I understand that I'm opening a can of worms and I only have a few minutes left, so let me summarize it like this. You and I run into serious problems when we expect a personal God to be exactly like us. And honestly, I think that was one of the problems that Hume had. He set his own personal standards for assessing the nature of reality, and then he demanded that God fit his criteria. He creates a personal concept for what God should be like, and then complains when He's not. So here's what I think. Personally, I think David Hume was making himself the supreme arbiter of truth, even if he says otherwise. If he didn't see it or taste it or feel it, he said it couldn't be real. He was judging what was probable based on personal experience. Years ago, I was camping in the wilderness with some friends, and I mean the remote wilderness. We drove as far as we could down a fire road, and then we packed our canoes and gear into the forest for another 2 miles, and then paddled 5 hours into the middle of nowhere. My idea of paradise. And one night near the end of the trip, we were sleeping on the shore of this lake out in the open air. And as we laid there looking at the sky, this massive thunderstorm appeared on the horizon. But it was one of those storms where there wasn't a lot of rain, just lightning. So we stayed on the beach and watched it instead of getting into our tents. And I got to tell you, it was spectacular. But it was just getting started because suddenly the clouds parted right over the lake, creating this hole in the storm. And even though it was summer, the northern lights suddenly appeared, and they were as bright as I've ever seen. So now we had a ring of lightning with the northern lights in the middle, and all of it was reflected on the surface of the lake. And I don't know what the odds of witnessing something like that are. 1 in a million? Who knows? But ask yourself this. The only evidence you have for that story is me. But what are the odds I'm lying? Of course, it's possible I'm lying. But what reason would you have to doubt it, even though you might never see something like that as long as you live? So is it likely to be false just because you didn't see it? I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, I'm running out of time and I've barely gotten started. And of course, all we did was look at 2 pages of Hume. But what I'm hoping is that I've given you just enough to start questioning some of his assumptions. When David Hume tells me that eyewitness testimony that we find in the Bible is insufficient evidence to believe, he's also telling me that his personal experience of the universe and his assumptions of how things should work, well, that should be enough to convince you that he's right. And I know I'm oversimplifying things, but that's essentially what he says. This idea that his empirical data is better than yours. And maybe we'll have to pick this up again another day because so many people seem to think that Hume drove a nail in the coffin of Christianity. But I do have to ask, why would you take his word for it? I mean, what if we applied his criteria to his now ancient books? Why would his testimony be enough to refute the testimony of all these people? Why would I give up the personal experience I've had with God because of some Scottish writer who says that from his perspective, that just doesn't seem possible? You know, maybe it's better to just get a copy of the Bible and find out why so many people think this book is a compelling guide to experiencing God. I'm Shawn Boonstra. Thanks for joining me. This has been Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.